In the dead of night, on October 1st, 1910, a dynamite bomb ripped through the Los Angeles Times building, killing 21 people and shaking the city to its core. This was not just an act of terror. It was a declaration of war. A war between the city's union workers and one man of unimaginable power, Harrison Gray Otis. From the smoldering ruins of his newspaper, Otis would launch a brutal crusade to control Los Angeles, seeding a family dynasty that would rule for 4 generations through secrets, manipulation, and the sheer, unrelenting force of will. Born in Ohio in 1837, Harrison Gray Otis was a man forged in the crucible of the 19th century. His worldview was hammered into shape by the defining experiences of his generation, the harsh realities of frontier life, the moral certainty of the abolitionist movement, and the brutal, clarifying violence of the American Civil War. As a young man, he was a printer's apprentice, learning to set type by hand, a skill that gave him a visceral connection to the power of the printed word. But his defining chapter came when he answered Abraham Lincoln's call for volunteers. He fought with the 12th Ohio Infantry, seeing action in numerous bloody campaigns. He was wounded twice, a fact he would proudly carry for the rest of his life, and he rose through the ranks on the back of his courage and his rigid self-discipline. He left the Army with the rank of brevet lieutenant colonel, and the title of colonel or general, as he later preferred, became fused to his identity. The war taught him a lesson he would never forget, that victory belongs to the side with the most power, the firmest convictions, and the utter willingness to crush its enemy. After the war, he drifted through a series of jobs: government clerk, politician, publisher of a small newspaper in Santa Barbara. He was searching for a stage grand enough for his ambitions. He found it in 1882 when he arrived in Los Angeles. He was 45 years old, a man of imposing physical presence with a bristling beard and eyes that seemed to bore through you. He saw in this dusty town a chance to build a legacy, an empire on his own terms. He bought a quarter interest in a struggling 4-page newspaper called the Los Angeles Daily Times. The paper was a shoestring operation, on the verge of bankruptcy, but Otis saw its potential, not just as a business, but as a weapon, a tool to impose his will on this burgeoning city. The world of Los Angeles journalism in the 1880s was a bare-knuckle brawl. Several papers competed for dominance, their pages filled with sensationalism, personal attacks, and fierce political partisanship. Otis waded into this fray with grim determination. He worked relentlessly, often setting type himself, writing fiery editorials, and managing the books. He was a micromanager, obsessed with every detail of the operation. Through a series of shrewd business deals and relentless pressure, he consolidated his control. By 1886, Otis had consolidated control of the Los Angeles Times, eventually becoming sole owner and publisher. The Herald remained a competitor, though the Times steadily gained dominance. The paper and the city were now his to shape, and shape them he did with a single-minded ferocity that was breathtaking. From his editor's desk, he began 2 great crusades that would define his life and the future of Southern California. The first was to sell the Los Angeles Dream. Otis was an early promoter and strong supporter of the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce in the late 1880s, using the Times to amplify its booster campaigns. This was not a passive group of businessmen. It was an aggressive, well-funded propaganda machine. Using the Times as his megaphone, Otis blanketed the country with a carefully constructed myth. He painted a picture of Southern California as a subtropical Eden, a paradise on earth for hard-working, God-fearing white Anglo-Saxon families from the frozen Midwest. The Times published breathless articles about the eternal sunshine, the fertile soil that could grow anything, and the endless economic opportunities. The Chamber of Commerce funded special train cars called California on Wheels that toured the country, showcasing the state's agricultural bounty. They papered the Midwest with pamphlets promising health, wealth, and happiness under the California sun. Otis was, in essence, inventing the image of Southern California that still exists today. He wasn't just reporting on the city. He was creating the population that would read his paper, work in the businesses he championed, and vote for the political order he was building. And it worked. A massive land boom in the late 1880s saw the city's population explode as tens of thousands of people cashed in their life savings and headed west, chasing the dream Otis was selling. But this paradise had a serpent, an evil that, in Otis's eyes, threatened to destroy everything he was building: organized labor. His second great crusade, the one he pursued with even more venomous passion, was the complete and utter destruction of the union movement in Los Angeles. To Otis, a union was not an organization fighting for fair wages or safe working conditions. It was a moral abomination, an un-American conspiracy against the sacred rights of the property owner. It was an affront to the natural order of things, where strong men like himself led and lesser men followed. He filled the editorial pages of the Los Angeles Times with volcanic prose, a daily torrent of invective that was shocking even for the era. He branded union organizers as vultures, leeches, and corrupt and brutal syndicates. He called striking workers gas pipe ruffians and dynamite assassins. His newspaper became the central pillar of the city's Merchants and Manufacturers Association, an organization dedicated to maintaining Los Angeles as an open-shop town, a fortress of anti-unionism where no worker could be forced to join a union to hold a job. The Times refused to hire union printers, and Otis ruthlessly crushed any attempt by his employees to organize. This wasn't just a political stance, it was a holy war, and it would soon escalate into real deadly violence. By the early 1900s, Los Angeles was the final frontier in the national battle between capital and labor. While cities like San Francisco were heavily unionized, LA remained the bastion of the open shop, a fact that enraged union leaders across the country. They saw the city as a threat, a low-wage cancer that could spread and undermine their gains elsewhere. They decided to make a stand. A series of bitter, often violent strikes rocked the city, targeting the metal trades, the breweries, and the streetcar companies. And at the center of it all, cheering on the strikebreakers, vilifying the strikers, and stiffening the spines of the business owners, was General Harrison Gray Otis and the Los Angeles Times. The unions came to see the newspaper not just as the voice of the enemy, but as the enemy itself. The newspaper building, a magnificent new structure at the corner of First and Broadway, became a symbol of everything they were fighting against. They called it the citadel of a single man's opinion. The stage was set for a tragedy. The tension reached a fever pitch in the summer of 1910 during a citywide metalworkers' strike. On the night of October 1st, just after 1 a.m., a massive explosion ripped through the Los Angeles Times building. The blast was so powerful it blew out windows for blocks around. It had been planted in an alleyway beneath the building known as Ink Alley, next to natural gas lines and barrels of flammable ink. The explosion ignited the gas mains, and the building was instantly engulfed in a horrific inferno. Inside, nearly 100 night shift employees, printers, proofreaders, and linotype operators were trapped. 21 of them would not make it out alive. Otis was at his home nearby when he heard the blast. Rushing to the scene, he found his life's work a smoldering ruin. the air thick with the smell of burnt paper and death. But his spirit was not broken. It was hardened into something terrible and absolute. He saw the attack not as a tragedy, but as a confirmation of everything he had been saying for years. This was the work of the Union dynamitards he had warned about. This was murder. In the chaos of the aftermath, he set up a makeshift office in a nearby building, and with the city still reeling, he penned one of the most famous editorials of his career, a defiant roar of fury that ran in the next day's paper. It began, "Oh, you anarchic scum, you cowardly murderers, you assassins of the night, you have done your worst, and you have failed." He vowed to rebuild bigger and stronger than before. He declared that the Times had not missed a single issue and never would. The bombing became his martyr's crown. He used the tragedy to galvanize public opinion across the nation against the Union movement. He was no longer just a publisher. He was a hero, a brave warrior defending civilization against the forces of anarchy. The ensuing investigation, led by the famed private detective William J. Burns, became a national sensation. The trail eventually led to two brothers, John J. and James B. McNamara, both high-ranking officials in the Iron Workers Union. Their arrest and extradition to Los Angeles set the stage for what was billed as the trial of the century. The American Federation of Labor, the nation's largest union organization, rallied to the brothers' defense, raising a massive legal fund and hiring the most famous defense attorney in America, the legendary Clarence Darrow. Darrow and the unions insisted the McNamara brothers were innocent, framed by a vast conspiracy of capitalist tycoons led by Otis himself. The trial was a spectacle, capturing the attention of the entire country. But behind the scenes, Darrow quickly realized the evidence against his clients was overwhelming. Facing the prospect of a certain conviction and the hanging of his clients, Darrow made a fateful decision. He negotiated a plea bargain. In a stunning courtroom reversal that shocked the world, the McNamara brothers pleaded guilty. James, who had planted the bomb, was sentenced to life in prison. John received 15 years. The Union movement was shattered, its credibility destroyed. Clarence Darrow himself was later indicted on charges of attempting to bribe jurors, a scandal that nearly ended his career. For Harrison Gray Otis, it was total victory. He had not only defeated his enemies in the court of law, but had also won an overwhelming victory in the court of public opinion. He had broken the back of organized labor in Los Angeles for a generation. This victory solidified his absolute power. He built a new fortress-like headquarters for the Times, a monument to his triumph. He built himself a grand, eccentric mansion called the Bivouac, which he decorated with cannons and military paraphernalia. He ruled his newspaper and his city like a feudal lord, his opinions shaping policy and making or breaking political careers. But even as he stood at the apex of his power, a new force was rising within his own family. A man who was quiet where Otis was loud, subtle where Otis was blunt, but who possessed a cunning and a vision for empire that would dwarf even that of the old general. This man had joined the paper as a humble clerk, married the general's daughter, and was now quietly learning the levers of power. He was about to take Otis's foundation of ideological warfare and build upon it a staggering empire of land and wealth. His name was Harry Chandler. The general had built the fortress, but the true dynasty was about to begin. If Harrison Gray Otis was the hammer that forged Los Angeles, Harry Chandler was the master strategist who designed its future. His story, unlike the general's, was not one of battlefield heroics or thunderous editorials. It was a quiet, relentless climb, a masterclass in networking, foresight, and the art of seeing angles that no one else could. His power was not in what he said, but in what he knew, and more importantly, who he knew. He was the quiet king of an unofficial kingdom, a man who operated in the shadows and transformed the Chandler family from mere newspaper publishers into the unelected rulers of Southern California. Born in Landaff, New Hampshire in 1864, Harry Chandler's early life was unremarkable. He was a student at Dartmouth College when his studies were cut short by a severe lung ailment, likely tuberculosis. In a scene that would become part of his personal mythology, he was competing in a starch wrestling contest, a bizarre college ritual, when he was thrown into a vat of freezing starch, triggering a catastrophic hemorrhage in his lungs. His doctors gave him a grim prognosis and the standard advice of the era for lungers: go west, seek a warm, dry climate. It was a death sentence for many, but for Harry Chandler, it was the beginning of his life. He arrived in California in 1882, a frail, nearly penniless young man in search of a cure. He found work on a fruit ranch, and the story he loved to tell was that he made his first small fortune by developing a system to deliver fresh fruit to the doorsteps of Pasadena's wealthy residents. Whether apocryphal or not, the story reveals the core of his genius. He was a master of logistics and distribution. He didn't just see a product, he saw the entire system required to move it from its source to its final destination. It was a skill he would soon apply on a much grander scale. In 1885, he walked into the offices of the Los Angeles Times and took a job in the circulation department. At the time, circulation was a brutish, haphazard affair, but Chandler saw it as a science. He meticulously mapped out the entire Southern California region, creating a vast, intricate network of delivery routes that extended far beyond the city limits. While other papers were content to sell on street corners, Chandler used Pony Express riders, carriages, and eventually motor cars to ensure the Times reached every remote ranch, every small town, and every isolated farm. He understood a fundamental truth of the newspaper business: influence follows distribution. Every new subscriber in a dusty outpost was another mind shaped by General Otis's fierce editorials, another vote for the political machine they were building. The general was impressed. He saw in this quiet, calculating young man a reflection of his own ambition, refined into a more efficient modern form. The professional relationship was cemented by a personal one. Chandler, then a widower with a young daughter, began to court Marion Otis, the general's fiercely intelligent and capable daughter. They married in 1894, a union that formally fused Chandler's strategic genius with Otis's raw power. He was no longer just an employee. He was the heir apparent. He rose quickly through the ranks, from circulation manager to business manager to general manager, while Otis thundered from the editorial page, waging his public wars against the unions. Chandler quietly worked behind the scenes, consolidating the family's financial interests and laying the groundwork for the single most audacious and profitable scheme in the history of Los Angeles. A scheme that would be built on secrecy, deception, and water. At the dawn of the 20th century, the paradise Otis had marketed so brilliantly had a fatal flaw. It was running out of water. The Los Angeles River, the city's primary water source, was little more than a seasonal trickle. The relentless growth that the Times had championed was pushing the city towards a catastrophic drought. Without a new, massive source of water, the dream of a great metropolis would wither and die in the California sun. The city's leaders, led by a former mayor named Fred Eaton and a brilliant self-taught engineer named William Mulholland, devised a secret, audacious plan. Eaton, who had spent years exploring the Sierra Nevada mountains, knew of a remote, sparsely populated agricultural region called the Owens Valley. The valley was fed by the Owens River, a torrent of fresh snowmelt from the mountains that created a lush green oasis in the middle of the desert. The plan was as simple as it was ruthless. They would buy up the land and water rights in the Owens Valley and then build a massive aqueduct, a man-made river stretching over 230 miles, to divert the entire river and bring it to Los Angeles. It was a project of epic proportions, an engineering marvel that would require a vast fortune and immense political will, and its success depended on absolute secrecy. If the farmers of the Owens Valley knew the city's true intentions, the price of their land and water would skyrocket, making the project impossible. Almost nobody in Los Angeles knew about this plan, but Harry Chandler did. Through his position at the nexus of the city's business and political elite, Chandler was brought into the inner circle. He understood immediately what this secret meant. He saw an angle that even the project's planners had overlooked. The aqueduct, as designed, would not pour its water directly into the reservoirs of Los Angeles. Its terminus was planned for the northern edge of the San Fernando Valley, a vast, arid, and sparsely populated expanse of cheap ranch land that lay just outside the city limits. The official reason was gravity. It was the most efficient endpoint for the aqueduct's flow. But Chandler realized the unofficial truth. Whoever owned that worthless, sun-baked land when the water arrived would become incomprehensibly generationally rich. Working in the shadows, moving with a speed and secrecy that was breathtaking, Chandler assembled a powerful syndicate of investors. The group was a who's who of the Los Angeles oligarchy. His father-in-law, Harrison Gray Otis, railroad tycoon Henry Huntington, a man who owned the city's entire streetcar system, and other powerful bankers and railroad executives. This cabal, later known as the San Fernando Valley Syndicate, began to quietly buy up huge swathes of the valley. They used a web of front men and shell corporations to conceal their identities, paying rock-bottom prices, sometimes as little as a few dollars an acre, from unsuspecting ranchers who were told the land was being acquired for agricultural purposes. In just over a year, Chandler's syndicate had secretly purchased over 120,000 acres, securing a dominant position over the most strategically valuable land in the Southern Valley. In 1905, with the land securely in their possession, the Los Angeles Times broke the story of the aqueduct, championing it as the city's salvation. The paper whipped up public support for the massive bond measures needed to fund the project, portraying it as a triumph of civic foresight and a matter of life and death for the city. It never mentioned, of course, that its own publisher and his son-in-law stood to make a gargantuan fortune from the very project they were promoting. The citizens of Los Angeles, terrified of drought, overwhelmingly approved the bonds. The construction of the aqueduct was a monumental undertaking, a brutal 5-year war against the desert. When the water finally arrived in 1913, William Mulholland stood before a crowd of thousands at the aqueduct's terminus and uttered his famously brief, iconic words, "There it is. Take it." The citizens of Los Angeles took the water, but Harry Chandler and his syndicate took the profits. The moment the aqueduct opened, the value of their land in the San Fernando Valley exploded. It was a story so audacious, so steeped in insider dealing and calculated deception, that it would later form the basis for the classic film Chinatown. The reality, however, was even more complex and far-reaching. The city of Los Angeles, now flush with stolen water, annexed the newly fertile San Fernando Valley. Chandler and his partners subdivided their vast holdings, creating the blueprint for the sprawling, low-density suburban landscape that would come to define Los Angeles in the 20th century. The San Fernando Valley Syndicate reaped enormous profits. Historians estimate tens of millions of dollars, equivalent to billions today. This single, masterful act of insider dealing became the financial bedrock of the Chandler empire, elevating the family from merely wealthy to unimaginably powerful. When Harrison Gray Otis died in 1917, Harry Chandler officially took the reins as publisher of the Los Angeles Times. The era of the empire builder had truly begun. He now had it all: the newspaper to shape public opinion and the capital to shape the physical world. He leveraged the paper's influence to expand his personal fortune into every corner of the Southern California economy. His empire was a vast interlocking web of interests. He owned the 270,000-acre Tejon Ranch, one of the largest private landholdings in California. He was a pioneer in industrial agriculture, owning vast tracts of cotton and citrus groves. He invested in oil, banking, shipping, and insurance. He saw the future and built it. He helped create the Hollywoodland real estate development, its iconic sign a permanent advertisement for the world he was crafting. He was a supporter and early backer of Caltech's growth, helping attract funding and prestige. He was a key investor and board member of Douglas Aircraft, helping to make Southern California the epicenter of the burgeoning aerospace industry. He built the Biltmore Hotel, a palace designed to attract the wealthy tourists and investors he needed to fuel his projects. He effectively controlled the city's infrastructure, its industry, and its finances, and he controlled its politics. Like Otis, he used the newspaper as a political cudgel, but with far more sophistication. His power was most nakedly demonstrated in 1934 during the depths of the Great Depression. The muckraking socialist author Upton Sinclair, famous for his novel The Jungle, was running for governor of California on a radical platform to end poverty in California, EPIC. Sinclair's message resonated with millions of desperate Californians, and he swept the Democratic primary. He was the clear favorite to win the general election, a prospect that terrified the state's conservative establishment, and no one was more terrified than Harry Chandler. What followed was one of the most ruthless and effective smear campaigns in American political history. Chandler and the Times orchestrated a coordinated assault that mobilized the full power of California's corporate elite. The newspaper branded Sinclair a communist, an atheist, and a dangerous revolutionary who would destroy the American way of life. They ran a daily box on the front page, often quoting Sinclair's fictional novels out of context, to make it seem as though he endorsed free love and the abolition of the church. But Chandler's masterstroke was to enlist the help of the Hollywood movie studios. He pressured studio heads like Louis B. Mayer of MGM to produce fake newsreels. These short films, shown in cinemas across the state, featured actors posing as ordinary citizens. In some, well-dressed, respectable-looking people would announce they were leaving California because of the impending Sinclair menace. In others, scruffy, menacing-looking actors portraying vagrants and hobos would praise Sinclair, declaring that they were flocking to California to live off his socialist programs. It was a pioneering use of cinematic propaganda, a chilling preview of the political tactics that would become commonplace decades later. Sinclair's massive lead in the polls evaporated. He lost the election decisively. Harry Chandler had proven that the Times could not only elect candidates, but utterly destroy them. He operated through a network of secretive committees, like the Committee of 25, a clandestine group of the city's most powerful businessmen who met to coordinate their plans for the region's development. He rarely gave interviews and almost never made public speeches. His power was felt, not seen. He was the ultimate puppeteer. This desire for control extended even to his own mortality. In his later years, he became a devotee of the bizarre medical theories of a quack doctor named John R. Brinkley, who claimed he could restore youth and vitality by transplanting goat glands into his human patients. Chandler reportedly underwent the procedure, a strange, desperate act by a man who had conquered a city and now sought to conquer death itself. By his death in 1944, Chandler's fortune was immense. Contemporary reports called him one of California's richest men, but precise valuations, e.g., $500 million, are speculative. He had transformed his father-in-law's vision into a tangible, sprawling empire of land, money, and political power, with the Los Angeles Times as its powerful, beating heart. He had been the Shadow King for nearly 3 decades. The foundations were set, but the dynasty was about to enter a new phase, one defined not by land grabs and union busting, but by social ambition and the complex dynamics of a family already showing the first cracks in its facade. The throne was about to pass to his son, a man who would try to polish the rough edges of the family name and steer the empire into the modern age. If Harry Chandler was the empire builder, his son, Norman Chandler, was the prince born to inherit it. He was the first of the line who did not have to claw his way to the top. The throne was his by birthright. Where his grandfather Otis was a pugnacious warrior and his father Harry a secretive strategist, Norman was a polished patrician diplomat. He was handsome, mild-mannered, and exuded an air of quiet authority. He had been groomed from birth to take over the family business, educated at Stanford, and initiated into the empire's workings piece by piece. When he officially became publisher in 1944, upon Harry's death, the formal transition was seamless, though the underlying currents of family tension and competing interests remained. He was not a revolutionary, he was a custodian, a man whose primary role was to manage the vast, powerful kingdom his father had built and to steer it into the modern corporate age. But the story of this third generation of Chandlers is not just about Norman. In many ways, it's the story of his wife, a woman who possessed an ambition and a will of iron that rivaled any of the Chandler men, Dorothy Buffum Chandler, known to everyone as Buff. She was not content to merely be the wife of a powerful man. She would become a force of nature in her own right, a woman who would set out to launder the family's rough-hewn reputation and remake the very cultural landscape of Los Angeles. Their union, however, marked the first truly public eruption of the deep-seated dysfunction that ran like a fault line through the family. Dorothy came from a respected and prosperous family that owned the popular Buffum's department stores in Long Beach. But in the rigid, snobbish social hierarchy of Pasadena's old money, this was a critical distinction. The Buffums were in trade. They were merchants. The Chandlers, for all their ruthless beginnings, saw themselves as industrial titans and landed gentry. To the Chandler clan, especially to Norman's sisters, Dorothy was an outsider, a shop girl from the wrong side of the social tracks, whose ambition was seen as unseemly and sharp-edged. When she and Norman were married in 1922, the family feud exploded into open warfare. In a stunning and calculated act of social cruelty, Harry Chandler's 5 daughters, Norman's own sisters, collectively boycotted the wedding. It was a brutal public snub, a declaration that Dorothy was not, and never would be, truly one of them. The wound from that day would never fully heal. It imbued Buff with a relentless drive to prove herself, to not only conquer the social world that had rejected her, but to rebuild it in her own image, with herself at its center. The boycott cast a long, cold shadow over the family's private life, even as its public power reached its zenith. Undeterred, Norman and Buff embarked on a shared project to remake the family's image. They wanted more than just wealth and power. They craved respectability. They wanted to shed the family's reputation as provincial robber barons and union busters and transform themselves into unimpeachable civic leaders and patrons of the arts. While Norman quietly and efficiently ran the newspaper and the expanding business empire, Buff launched a one-woman crusade to drag Los Angeles, kicking and screaming into the ranks of the world's great cultural capitals. Her great obsession, the project that would define her life, was the creation of a world-class performing arts center. In the 1950s, for all its Hollywood glamour and booming economy, Los Angeles was a cultural backwater. The city's Philharmonic Orchestra, its pride and joy, played in a dilapidated auditorium that was falling apart. To Buff, this was a civic embarrassment. A great city, she believed, needed a great cultural heart, a monument to rival the concert halls of New York and London, and she decided that she would be the one to build it. She launched an audacious fundraising campaign with a theatrical flair that her father-in-law would have admired. At one of her first major fundraising dinners, she famously held up a bag and announced it was her buck bag, into which the city's wealthiest citizens would place their million-dollar pledges. She once tore a page from the telephone book and vowed to call every single name on it if she had to. She was tireless, charming, and utterly intimidating. She cajoled, flattered, and bullied the city's elite, the old money families of Pasadena and the new money moguls of Hollywood, into opening their wallets. She bridged social divides that had seemed impassable, forcing the city's disparate power centers to unite behind her singular vision. Over nearly a decade, she raised an astonishing $19 million, the vast majority from private donors. When the Los Angeles Music Center, with its magnificent centerpiece, the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion, opened its doors in 1964, it was more than just a collection of concert halls. It was a monument to her iron will. It was a declaration that Los Angeles had arrived as a major cultural force, and it was the final triumphant act of social revenge for the woman who had once been snubbed by the city's elite. She was no longer an outsider. She was the queen of Los Angeles society. Meanwhile, her husband Norman was overseeing an equally profound, if quieter, transformation of the family's business. He was a shrewd and forward-thinking manager who understood that the old model of a family-owned fiefdom was becoming obsolete. In 1964, in a move that would have profound and unforeseen consequences for the dynasty's future, he listed the family's holding company, the Times Mirror Company, on the New York Stock Exchange. This infused the company with a massive amount of public capital, allowing it to expand aggressively. Under Norman's leadership, Times Mirror went on a shopping spree, acquiring other newspapers like Newsday in New York and the Dallas Times-Herald, as well as television stations, book publishers, and forestry companies. He transformed the company from a local institution into a national media conglomerate. But taking the company public also planted the seeds of the dynasty's eventual demise. It brought in outside shareholders and a board of directors who were legally obligated to prioritize profits above all else. For the first time, the family's control was no longer absolute. The newspaper was no longer just a family legacy, it was a corporate asset, its performance measured in quarterly earnings reports. For now, with the family still holding a controlling interest, this was not a problem, but the clock was ticking. Politically, Norman maintained the family tradition with unwavering loyalty. The Los Angeles Times remained the most powerful voice for the Republican Party west of the Mississippi, and no politician in American history owed more to a single newspaper than Richard Nixon. The Chandlers didn't just support Nixon. In a very real sense, they created him. The relationship began in 1946 when Nixon, a young, ambitious Navy veteran, launched his first campaign for Congress. The Times championed him relentlessly, painting him as a patriotic hero, and his opponent, the respected liberal incumbent Jerry Voorhis, as a dangerous communist sympathizer. The paper's biased coverage and smear tactics were instrumental in Nixon's victory. 4 years later, in 1950, they did it again, helping Nixon win a Senate seat in a vicious campaign against Congresswoman Helen Gahagan Douglas, whom the Times helped brand the Pink Lady. From his first run for Congress through his campaigns for the Senate, the vice presidency under Eisenhower, and ultimately his runs for the presidency, the Los Angeles Times was Nixon's most powerful and steadfast ally. The paper championed his anti-communist crusades, defended him during his scandals, and helped shape his public image as a tough, seasoned statesman. The Chandlers' support was so crucial, so unwavering, that Nixon's political career is almost impossible to imagine without it. They provided the platform, the credibility, and the political muscle that launched him onto the national stage. This was the peak, the gilded age of the Chandler dynasty. The family stood at the apex of its power and prestige. Norman presided over a vast modern media empire. Buff was the undisputed cultural arbiter of the city. They controlled the city's dominant newspaper, its most important cultural institution, and had a direct line to the White House. They had successfully laundered their rough-hewn origins into a lustrous, high society sheen. They were no longer just the kings of Los Angeles. They were American royalty. They had shaped the city in their image, a sprawling, suburban, car-dependent metropolis, conservative in its politics and business-friendly in its ethos. The vast network of freeways that crisscrossed the region, championed relentlessly by the Times, was a physical manifestation of their vision. They had built a kingdom in the sun, and it seemed unassailable. But a new generation was waiting in the wings, a son who was nothing like his father or his grandfather, a man who seemed to embody the sun-drenched, carefree spirit of California that his own family had helped to create, yet who was deeply ambivalent about the power he was destined to inherit. He loved surfing more than society balls, and he was beginning to believe that a newspaper's first loyalty should be to the truth, not to the family's business interests or political agenda. He was about to be handed the keys to the kingdom, just as America was entering the most turbulent decade of the 20th century. In his quest to build a great newspaper, he would honor his family's ambition but betray its ideology, and in doing so, he would inadvertently set the stage for the dynasty's spectacular downfall. His name was Otis Chandler. Otis Chandler was the golden boy of the dynasty's fourth generation, the heir apparent to the Chandler throne. But he was a different breed entirely. Tall, handsome, and a world-class athlete, he seemed to embody the California dream his own family had so successfully marketed to the world. He grew up in the rarefied, suffocating air of the family's Pasadena mansions, but his heart was at the beach. He was a champion shot putter who competed for Stanford, a passionate weightlifter, and an obsessive surfer, drawn to the raw, physical challenges of the ocean far more than the political chess games of the boardroom. For much of his early life, he seemed determined to escape the crushing weight of his family's legacy. His father, Norman, a man who believed in duty above all else, had to practically drag him into the family business. He put Otis through a grueling 7-year apprenticeship, designed to forge him into a suitable heir. Otis was forced to work in every single department of the newspaper, from the deafening roar of the press room and the gritty world of the delivery trucks, to the clatter of the newsroom and the hushed tones of the advertising department. He was a reluctant prince, but he was also a Chandler. The sense of duty, the weight of expectation, was ultimately inescapable. In 1960, at the age of just 32, Otis Chandler took over from his father as publisher of the Los Angeles Times. The world he had inherited and the America that was dawning were about to collide. Otis had a single, all-consuming ambition, one that put him on a collision course with his family's entire history. He wanted to make the Los Angeles Times a great newspaper, not just a profitable one, not just an influential one, but one of the best in the world. He was privately embarrassed by its long-standing reputation as a biased, parochial, right-wing propaganda sheet for the Republican Party. He wanted to build a paper that would be mentioned in the same breath as the New York Times and the Washington Post. He wanted journalistic respect. His revolution began with money. He opened the family coffers and poured millions into the newsroom, an area his predecessors had often treated as a necessary evil. He began a national talent search, hiring the best and brightest reporters and editors he could find from around the country, luring them to Los Angeles with salaries that were unheard of in the industry. He expanded the paper's reach exponentially, opening news bureaus across the globe, from Washington, D.C. to Tokyo, from Moscow to Saigon. By the late 1970s, the Times would have a network of international and domestic bureaus that rivaled any newspaper on earth, giving it a global perspective that was a universe away from its provincial past. The results were immediate and dramatic. The quality and depth of the journalism soared. In 1962, the paper won its first ever Pulitzer Prize, a watershed moment that signaled a new era. Many more would follow in the coming years, but Otis's revolution wasn't just about quality, it was about ideology. And his first major test, a battle that would define his tenure and create a permanent schism within his own family, came just a year into his reign. In 1961, Otis greenlit a groundbreaking 5-part investigative series on a secretive, far-right, anti-communist organization that was rapidly gaining influence in Southern California, the John Birch Society. This was an act of journalistic heresy. The John Birch Society was not some fringe group. Its members included some of the most powerful business and political figures in the region, the very people who had been the Chandler family's staunchest allies for generations. More pointedly, several members of Otis's own extended family, including his arch-conservative Uncle Philip, were prominent supporters of the society. The series was a meticulously researched, damning expose of the society's extremist views and conspiratorial thinking, and the backlash was instantaneous and ferocious. The paper was flooded with thousands of angry letters and subscription cancellations. Advertisers, prodded by the city's conservative elite, threatened to pull their accounts, but the most painful blows came from within his own family. His uncle, his cousins, and their allies on the Times Mirror board were apoplectic. To them, Otis wasn't just committing journalistic malpractice. He was a traitor to his class, to his family, and to everything they stood for. The series was a public declaration of independence from the ideology of his forefathers. It alienated him from the conservative majority of his family, opening a chasm that would never close. But Otis doubled down. In 1965, when the predominantly black neighborhood of Watts in South Los Angeles exploded in a firestorm of rioting, the Times' coverage was revolutionary. Instead of simply reporting on the violence and crime with the predictable law and order slant of his predecessors, Otis dispatched a massive team of reporters to dig into the root causes of the unrest. For weeks, the paper published in-depth, nuanced analyses of the poverty, racism, police brutality, and systemic neglect that had led to the explosion. The paper's coverage won it another Pulitzer Prize and set a new standard for urban journalism. But for the old guard of Los Angeles, and for many in his own family, it was further proof that Otis had lost his way, that he was siding with the enemies of the established order they had built. Under Otis, the Los Angeles Times reached its golden age. It was consistently ranked as one of the top 3 newspapers in America. It was a journalistic powerhouse. And through the 1970s and 1980s, the Times ranked among the nation's top newspapers in circulation and advertising revenue. Otis had succeeded in his ambition beyond his wildest dreams. But his triumphs as a publisher came at a great personal cost. He was viewed as a liberal pariah by the conservative wing of his family. They felt he was squandering the political capital they had spent generations accumulating, trading real-world power for the abstract prestige of journalism awards. The family's internal business meetings became tense, bitter affairs. The dysfunctional label that had long haunted the Chandlers' private lives was now a defining feature of their corporate existence. The power struggles intensified throughout the 1970s and 80s. Cousins and uncles, who controlled significant blocks of company stock, constantly challenged Otis's leadership and the paper's progressive direction. They were more interested in quarterly profits and shareholder dividends than in Pulitzer Prizes. In 1985, the simmering conflict finally boiled over. In a boardroom coup, Otis Chandler was pushed out as chairman of the Times Mirror Company, the empire his family had controlled for a century. He was sidelined, his authority diminished. The professional managers he had brought in were also replaced, a clear sign of the internal chaos and the family's inability to agree on a strategic direction. The succession plan was in tatters. The next generation of Chandlers showed little interest or aptitude for leadership. The drive, the ambition, and the unity of purpose that had defined the first 4 generations seemed to have evaporated. The family that had once ruled a city as its private fiefdom was becoming, as one observer later put it, just faded old money. By the end of the 20th century, the world the Chandlers had built was facing an existential threat. The rise of the internet was beginning to tear apart the very business model that had sustained newspapers for 200 years. Circulation was beginning a long, slow decline. Advertising revenue, the lifeblood of the industry, was starting to migrate online. Wall Street was growing impatient with the thin profit margins of the newspaper business. For the first time, the Times Mirror Company, the jewel of the Chandler empire, began to look vulnerable. Within the scattered, feuding branches of the Chandler family, a debate was raging. The family was now into its 5th and 6th generations, with dozens of cousins spread across the country. For many of them, the Los Angeles Times was not a sacred public trust or a family legacy. It was an underperforming asset in their investment portfolio. They saw their immense wealth tied up in a declining industry, and they were getting nervous. The emotional connection to the paper, the sense of stewardship that had in his own way driven Otis, was fading. They were shareholders now, not patriarchs, and they wanted a return on their investment. The family trusts that held their controlling stake in the company were set to expire, which would dilute their voting power. It was a moment of decision: double down on the legacy or cash out. In March of 2000, the unthinkable happened. The Chandler family, after nearly 120 years of continuous control, agreed to sell the Times Mirror Company, including the Los Angeles Times, Newsday, the Baltimore Sun, and other assets, to the Chicago-based Tribune Company. The price was $8.3 billion. It was one of the largest media mergers in history. The sale sent a shockwave through the worlds of journalism and finance. For the family, it was a moment of immense financial gain. Their vast but somewhat illiquid fortune was suddenly transformed into billions of dollars in cash and Tribune stock. But for the city of Los Angeles and for the newspaper itself, it was a death blow. The institution that had defined, shaped, and dominated Southern California for more than a century was suddenly just another branch office, its fate now in the hands of anonymous executives in a boardroom 2,000 miles away. Former editor William F. Thomas described the tragic finality of the decision. Once the family gave up control, he said, the paper was just one more corporate asset, and you could be sure that sooner or later it would be treated that way. His words were prophetic. The collapse came faster and was more brutal than anyone could have imagined. Tribune Company, heavily leveraged from the purchase, imposed round after round of vicious budget cuts. The newsroom, which Otis had built into a global powerhouse, was decimated by layoffs. The foreign bureaus were shuttered one by one. The paper's ambition, its civic spirit, and its journalistic muscle were systematically stripped away. It became a shadow of its former self, a ghost haunting the city it once ruled. The physical symbols of the empire were sold off for parts. In 2016, the iconic Times Mirror Square, the historic headquarters that had served as the Dynasty's command center for decades, was sold to a Canadian real estate developer. For a time, the Los Angeles Times was forced to become a tenant in its own historic home. Then, in 2018, in the ultimate indignity, the newspaper was forced to abandon its downtown headquarters altogether and relocate to a sterile office park in the suburban city of El Segundo near the airport. The heart of Los Angeles had been ripped out and moved to the periphery. Otis Chandler, who had fought so hard to build the paper into something great, was reportedly heartbroken by the sale and the subsequent decline. The great institution he had built, the legacy he had forged, was dismantled in less than a decade. The dynasty that began with the iron will of a Civil War veteran had ended with the stroke of a pen in a corporate merger. Look around Los Angeles today, and you are seeing the ghosts of the Chandler family. Their legacy is in the very concrete of the freeways, the water in the taps, the skyline of downtown. They were the architects of the physical city. For 100 years, their will was its DNA. But the power that built it all, the power that flowed from the Los Angeles Times, is gone. When the family chose stock prices over stewardship, they didn't just sell a newspaper. They sold their throne. The dynasty didn't fade away. It evaporated overnight. Their story is the ultimate cautionary tale of American power, that an empire built to last 4 generations can be dismantled in a single moment of lost conviction. The Chandlers built Los Angeles, but in the end, they forgot what it meant to own it.